The chandelier above the Phoenix Ballroom held 12,000 crystals, and not one of them dared move as Kang Do-hyun stepped through the double doors. A waiter, mid-pour, tilted a bottle of Krug too far and let a single drop of champagne stain a linen tablecloth worth more than a year of his salary. He did not notice. No one noticed. Every eye in the room, every diplomat, every senator's wife, every silk-draped heiress, and every silver-haired shipping magnate had locked on to the man whose name was spoken only in whispers and never in headlines. And beside him, one step behind, walked a woman no one recognized. She wore champagne silk, no diamonds, no emeralds, no handbag stitched by an Italian house whose logo would signal her rank. Only a thin gold chain at her collarbone and a stillness that made the loudest people in Seoul feel suddenly uncomfortably ordinary. She was black, tall, unhurried, and her eyes moved across the ballroom the way a cartographer reads unfamiliar terrain, noting exits, noting faces, noting the woman near the west pillar who was already reaching for her clutch and adjusting her smile into a weapon. The whispers began before the doors even closed behind them. Interpreter, assistant, bodyguard maybe. Someone said charity liaison. Someone else, half drunk and too loud, said something crueler that a nearby elder immediately silenced with a look. Nobody guessed the truth. Nobody guessed that the quiet woman in the simple gown was the reason a man who owned harbors and legislators had walked into a public room for the first time in 3 years. Before this story goes further, before the woman in emerald across the room takes the first fatal step of the evening, pause for a breath. If stories about quiet women who let arrogance dig its own grave are the kind of stories that keep you up until 3 in the morning, subscribe now, because what happens in the next 40 minutes is not the kind of scene the internet forgets. Now, back to the ballroom. Back to the moment a stranger named Victoria Blake decided she had found her next husband. Victoria was 29 years old and had spent the last 6 of those years training herself for exactly this evening. She had studied Kang Do-hyun the way sculptors study marble. She knew he preferred single malt over champagne. She knew he wore Keaton suits cut by a tailor in Naples who had cut for his father. She knew he had not been photographed with a woman in public since a magazine cover in Paris 7 years ago, and she knew that the woman in that photograph had never appeared in a frame again. Victoria had interpreted this absence as availability. It was the first of many mistakes she would make that night, though she would not recognize any of them as mistakes until it was already too late. She stood near the west pillar in an emerald gown cut low enough to demand attention and slit high enough to reward it. Her hair was ink black, glossy, sculpted into an artful chignon by a stylist she had flown in from Milan. Her jewelry was rented. Her handbag was leased. Her confidence, however, was entirely her own, a currency she had learned to counterfeit so well she now believed it was real. She watched Kang Do-hyun accept a glass from a waiter without looking at the waiter. She watched the quiet black woman at his side decline hers with a small shake of the head. She watched and she calculated, and she smiled the small, satisfied smile of a woman who has just seen an unlocked door. Then she began her walk. Across the ballroom, seated at a round table draped in ivory, an elderly Korean woman named Madame Seo lowered her wine glass with the careful precision of someone who understood that the temperature of a room had just changed. Beside her, her granddaughter whispered, "Halmione, what is happening?" Madame Seo did not answer. She had lived in Seoul long enough to know that some questions were better observed than voiced. She simply set her wine down and folded her hands in her lap and waited for the young woman in the emerald gown to complete a mistake she had clearly been rehearsing all week. Victoria did not walk. She glided, every step calibrated, every breath composed. She had been raised in a family that had once owned 3 West London townhouses and had lost 2 of them to bad decisions and worse husbands, and she had been taught since the age of 11 that a woman's beauty was the only inheritance the world could not repossess. She reached the small clearing where Kang Do-hyun stood, and without a pause, without a request, without even a courteous glance at the quiet woman beside him, Victoria stepped between them. It was a small physical act. It should have meant nothing. But every experienced eye in the room understood immediately that a boundary had been crossed and that the boundary had not been crossed by accident. "Mr. Kang." Victoria said, her voice pitched low, warm, calibrated for intimacy in a public setting. I have been trying to catch your attention all evening. Kang Do-hyun looked at her. He did not smile. He did not step back. He did not step forward. His face carried the exact expression it had carried when he entered the ballroom, which was to say almost no expression at all. His eyes, dark and unhurried, moved from Victoria's face to her hand, which had risen, uninvited, to rest against the lapel of his jacket, and then back to her face. He said nothing. Victoria took his silence as invitation. "Your suit is beautiful," she murmured, letting her fingers linger against the fabric a heartbeat longer than propriety allowed. But then powerful men always know exactly what to wear, and what they deserve. A soft ripple of laughter rose from a nearby cluster of guests. It was not kind laughter. It was the laughter of people who had already begun to understand that they were watching something ugly, and who were pretending it was entertainment because pretending was easier than intervening. Behind Victoria, the quiet black woman had not moved. She had not spoken. She had not even turned her head. She had simply, with a movement so small most guests missed it, lifted a glass of champagne from a passing tray and taken a slow, thoughtful sip. Madame Seo, at her table, noted this and permitted herself the smallest of smiles. Victoria pressed forward. "Powerful men deserve women who match them," she said, her hand still on his lapel, her tone still low. "Not translators, not staff, not the kind of women who follow one step behind." She had aimed the sentence like a blade, and she had aimed it unmistakably at the woman standing 3 feet away with a champagne glass in her hand. The quiet woman took another slow sip. Her eyes met Victoria's for the first time. They were unhurried, deeply brown, and completely without offense. They were the eyes of someone who had already forgiven Victoria for a crime Victoria did not yet realize she had committed. Victoria mistook the look for weakness. "I am hosting a small gathering at the Grand Hyatt penthouse after this," she continued, addressing Kang Do-hyun as though the woman beside him did not exist. "Just a few important people. I would love it if you join me. Alone." The word alone was delivered with a small tilt of her chin toward the quiet woman, a small dismissal so casual it was almost graceful. The ballroom did not gasp. Rooms like this one did not gasp. They simply became quieter, the way forests become quieter when a predator moves through them. Conversations dropped to murmurs. Murmurs dropped to breath. Even the string quartet on the far balcony seemed to lose confidence in its own melody. Victoria did not notice. Victoria was busy winning. She turned finally deliberately to the quiet woman. Her smile widened. Her voice climbed into a tone she reserved for waitstaff and unwanted cousins. "Sweetheart," she said, "are you his assistant or just another employee?" Someone near the bar exhaled a small, involuntary sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a wince. A waiter passing behind the woman in champagne silk froze mid-step, then continued walking with the exaggerated care of a man who had suddenly realized he was inside history. The quiet woman smiled. It was a small smile, polite, almost apologetic. "I will answer that later," she said. Her voice was low, warm, and unhurried. She spoke English with the faint softening of a Nigerian childhood and the crisp finish of a British education, and she spoke it as if she had all the time in the world. Victoria laughed. She actually laughed. She turned back to Kang Do-hyun with the shining certainty of a woman who believed she had just secured her future. Kang Do-hyun still had not spoken, but somewhere behind his silence a quiet decision was being made. Not by him, by the woman with the champagne glass. And the decision she was making was not to humiliate this stranger. Humiliation was a small pleasure, and the woman in champagne silk had never traded in small pleasures. The decision she was making was to permit the evening to unfold at exactly the pace it required, and to let the truth arrive on its own feet without being pushed. Because the truth was already walking toward the stage. The host, a silver-haired diplomat named Cha Min-ho, who had emceed the Phoenix Foundation Gala for 11 consecutive years, tapped the microphone twice. The room turned toward him with the practiced grace of people who had been trained since birth to face the source of authority in any room. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice smoothed by decades of practice. Before we proceed with the evening's program, I have the honor of announcing this year's most generous private donor to the Phoenix Foundation. A small ripple of anticipation moved through the ballroom. Every senior guest in the room had privately hoped it would be them. Every media camera in the balcony quietly adjusted focus. Victoria's hand tightened, just slightly, on Kang Do-hyun's lapel. Cha Min-ho smiled the smile of a man who had been waiting all evening for this exact sentence. "Please welcome to the stage," he said, "our chairwoman and this year's largest individual donor, Mrs. Kang." The ballroom did not gasp. It stopped. It stopped the way a heart stops between beats, briefly, involuntarily, and with a small internal jolt that the body registers before the mind understands. Somewhere, a champagne flute slipped from unsteady fingers and was caught mid-air by a waiter whose reflexes had just paid for his entire career. Somewhere else, a diplomat's wife audibly whispered a word her diplomat husband had never heard her use in public. The quiet black woman set her champagne glass down on a passing tray. She did not look at Victoria. She did not look at Kang Do-hyun. She turned, smoothed the front of her gown with one unhurried hand, and began to walk toward the stage. Every security guard in the ballroom straightened at once. Not gradually, all at once. 6 men in identical black suits, positioned discreetly at 6 different points along the walls, adjusted their posture in unison, as though pulled by invisible strings connected to the same silent hand. 2 board members near the front row rose and bowed as she passed. A senator from Busan lowered his eyes. A Chinese ambassador who had been mid-sentence stopped mid-sentence and did not resume. Victoria's hand fell from Kang Do-hyun's lapel. She had not decided to move it. It had simply, of its own accord, fallen. On the stage, the enormous LED wall behind the podium came to life. Photographs began to appear, one after another: a maternity hospital in Lagos, a research center in Nairobi, a children's shelter in Manila, a fleet of mobile clinics winding through rural Vietnam. And then, softly, in elegant white script across the screen, a single line resolved into focus. Chairwoman Naomi Kang. Founder, Adebayo Kang Global Humanitarian Trust. Below the name, a smaller line. Wife of Chairman Kang Do-hyun. The word wife struck the ballroom like a small, clean bell. Victoria's face went the color of old paper. She did not scream. She did not stagger. She simply stood exactly where she was, one hand hovering in the air where Kang Do-hyun's lapel had been, her carefully painted mouth open around a word she never quite managed to say. Her mind, trained for a decade to calculate advantage from any social configuration, was performing the calculation in reverse, running back through the last 12 minutes and understanding sentence by sentence, gesture by gesture, exactly what she had done. She had insulted his wife. She had touched him in front of his wife. She had propositioned him in front of his wife. She had called his wife an employee. And his wife had said, "I will answer that later." Later had arrived. Naomi Kang climbed the 3 steps to the stage with the same unhurried grace she had used to lift her champagne glass. She reached the podium. She rested her fingertips on the wood, the way a pianist rests her fingertips on a keyboard before the first note. She looked out at the ballroom, and the ballroom, all 430 guests of it, looked back. She did not look at Victoria. Not once. Victoria might as well have ceased to exist. And in a way, socially, in that particular room, in that particular city, on that particular evening, she had. Naomi spoke. "Thank you," she said. "I know many of you were expecting my husband to be the one standing here. He does not enjoy stages. He prefers to build things where cameras cannot find them, which is one of the many things I love about him." A small, careful laugh moved through the audience. It was the sound of a room remembering how to breathe. The Phoenix Foundation supports children who have lost parents to organized crime, Naomi continued. This year, we opened 4 new shelters, funded 3 trauma programs, and placed 211 orphan children into permanent protected homes. Each of those numbers is a life, not a statistic. A life. She paused. I know something about being one of those numbers. The ballroom did not move. When I was 9 years old, my father, a judge, refused a bribe. He believed the law was a promise, and he believed promises should be kept. 3 weeks later, men came to our home in the middle of the night. I survived because a stranger, a man I did not yet know, chose to intervene. He is now my father-in-law. He is not with us tonight, but I would like, if I may, to thank him publicly for the first time in 24 years. Somewhere in the back of the ballroom, a very old man in a very plain suit lowered his head. No one noticed him. He preferred it that way. Naomi's eyes found her husband's across the crowded room. Kang Do-hyun, who had not moved from where he stood, who had not spoken since he entered, who had allowed a stranger to touch his lapel and insult his wife because his wife had asked him, with a single glance to allow it, met her gaze. For a moment, there was no ballroom. There was no Victoria. There was no chandelier. There were no diplomats and no crystal and no whispers and no cameras. There were only two people who had known each other since one of them was a child, and the other was a boy who had been told that love was a weakness his family could not afford, and who had spent 24 years, quietly, patiently, in defiance of every warning their world had ever issued them, proving that particular sentence wrong. Then Naomi turned back to the microphone. "We judge people," she said, "by what we can see. We assume the loudest voice is the strongest. We assume the brightest jewel belongs to the most powerful woman. We assume the woman standing one step behind a powerful man must be less than him. And sometimes, ladies and gentlemen, sometimes the greatest power in a room wears the quietest smile." The ballroom rose. It was not a coordinated ovation. It was the ragged, involuntary ovation of a room that had just been taught something it had forgotten it needed to learn. Diplomats stood, senators stood, old money stood, new money stood. A waiter, forgetting himself entirely, set down his tray and stood. Victoria did not stand. Victoria was already walking. Backward at first, then sideways, then finally, mercifully, out of the ballroom through a service exit her handler had located for her, with the professional speed of a man who understood that some evenings ended earlier than planned. She did not remember passing the coat check. She did not remember her driver's face. She remembered only the cool of the January air and the strange, unfamiliar sensation of being the smallest person she had ever been. By morning, she was the most famous woman in the world for reasons no woman ever wants to be famous. The video went online within 40 minutes of the announcement. It had been filmed by 6 different phones from 6 different angles, and one of those phones belonged to a fashion editor who had disliked Victoria for years and had waited a very long time for exactly this opportunity. By dawn, Victoria's name was trending in 4 languages. By lunchtime, 3 luxury brands had quietly rescinded their ambassador contracts. By evening, her London publicist had stopped answering calls. Victoria sat in her hotel suite at the Grand Hyatt and watched her own destruction stream across her phone. She did not cry. She did not scream. She poured herself a glass of Sancerre with hands that did not quite tremble, and she drank it slowly, and she began, for the first time in her life, to think. She thought about the quiet woman with the champagne glass. She thought about the sentence, "I will answer that later." She thought about the phrase Naomi had used on the stage, "Sometimes the greatest power in a room wears the quietest smile." And she understood, with a clarity that arrived too late to save her, that Naomi Kang had not been speaking to the ballroom. She had been speaking to her. Victoria was not a stupid woman. Cruel, yes. Vain, yes. Ambitious to the point of self-destruction, certainly, but not stupid. And in the small, silent hours of that morning, alone in a suite paid for by a father who would soon stop paying for anything, she made a decision that surprised no one more than herself. She decided to find out who Naomi Kang really was. She began the way any well-connected socialite begins any investigation, with money, with contacts, and with the confidence that anything could be uncovered if one paid the right people. She wired retainers to 2 private investigators, one in London and one in Seoul. She promised bonuses. She promised discretion. She promised whatever they asked for. 3 days later, both investigators refused to continue, not because they had failed to find anything, because they had found nothing. Naomi Kang had no public record older than 8 years. No university transcript, no childhood photograph, no family registry, no school yearbook, no dental record, no pediatrician, no baptism certificate, no name in any archive of any orphanage in any country either investigator could access. She had appeared in the world 8 years ago as a fully formed adult woman with a philanthropic foundation and a marriage certificate, and behind her stretched a silence so complete that the older investigator, a man who had once traced a fugitive banker through 6 passports and 4 continents, sent Victoria a single sentence by encrypted message and then blocked her number. "Whoever erased this woman," he wrote, "did not want her found. Do not push further. You will not survive it." Victoria stared at that sentence for a long time. Elsewhere in Seoul, in a private office 39 floors above the Han River, Kang Do-hyun was reading a different message. It had been delivered to him by his head of internal security, a woman named Han Ji-eun, who had served his family for 15 years and had never once, in all of those years, entered his office without knocking. She had entered without knocking now. "Someone accessed the archive," Ji-eun said. Kang Do-hyun did not look up from the document on his desk. "Which archive?" "The sealed one." He set his pen down. "Which file?" Ji-eun did not answer immediately. She was a woman who had delivered many pieces of bad news in her career and had learned to allow her employer a small mercy of anticipation before confirming the worst. "Sir," she said. It was hers. Kang Do-hyun did not stand. He did not raise his voice. He simply, with a slowness that Ji-eun had never seen in him before, closed his eyes. For the first time in the 16 years Han Ji-eun had worked for him, Kang Do-hyun looked afraid. Because Naomi's file was not merely a marriage record. It was the only remaining document on Earth that connected the woman now known as Naomi Kang to a 9-year-old girl named Ngozi Adebayo, who had been declared dead by 3 governments and buried in an empty coffin in Lagos 24 years ago. That night, Kang Do-hyun did what he had not done in nearly a decade. He sat on the edge of the bed he shared with his wife, and he told her the truth. She listened. She did not weep. She did not rage. She listened the way she had listened, 24 years ago, when a strange Korean man had knelt beside a 9-year-old girl in a safe house in Abuja and told her in careful English that her parents were gone and that she was now, whether she wished it or not, his responsibility. She had listened then. She listened now. When he was finished, she reached across the bed and took his hand. "I know who did this," she said. He looked at her. "Do-hyun," she said quietly. "I have known for 6 months." He did not speak. "I did not tell you," she continued, "because I needed to be certain, and because I knew that if I told you before I was certain, you would burn the world down to protect me. And that is not the world I want us to leave behind." The memory came to him then, unbidden and complete, the way certain memories arrive when the body decides the mind is finally ready. He was 17 years old. He was standing in a garden in Gyeonggi in the last week of autumn. The maple leaves had turned the color of arterial blood, and they fell around him in a slow, unhurried rain. His father, then still alive, then still terrifying, then still the sun around which the entire Kang family orbited, stood beside him with his hands clasped behind his back. In front of them, seated on a stone bench in the pale afternoon light, was a 13-year-old girl. She wore a school uniform that did not quite fit her. Her hair had been braided by a housekeeper who had learned the technique from a YouTube video. She was reading a book too old for her, and she was reading it in Korean, a language she had been learning for 4 years with the ferocity of a child who understood that language was the only door she had left. His father spoke without looking at him. "You are not to fall in love with her." Kang Do-hyun, 17 and arrogant and already 6 feet tall, had turned to his father with the small, careful smile of a young man who had already decided to disobey. "I understand, father." His father had turned then, slowly, and had looked at him with eyes that had seen 40 years of war and had never once flinched. "No," his father said, "you do not." His father had walked away, and Kang Do-hyun, 17 years old, had sat down on the stone bench beside the small girl, reading the impossible book, and she had looked up at him with eyes the color of a river at dusk, and she had said, in her careful formal Korean, "You are Do-hyun, I am Ngozi. My name means blessing. I do not yet know if this is true." He had married her 9 years later in a private ceremony attended by 4 people. His father, his father's oldest friend, a monk, a judge, that was all. That was, for many years, all any human being had known. Until now. The next morning, in a private study in an estate outside Seoul that appeared on no map available to the public, Naomi Kang laid a folder open on a rosewood desk and began at last to explain. The organization was called the Eclipse Circle. It did not smuggle. It did not extort. It did not, in the ordinary sense of the word, kill. It operated in an older, quieter economy. The economy of governments, of central banks, of the small handful of families who had understood, sometime in the 19th century, that the true wealth of the world was not gold or oil, but the ability to decide what other people believed. The Eclipse Circle had ordered the death of Naomi's father because her father had been about to publish a ledger. The ledger named 17 ministers, 4 heads of state, and a small, well-dressed man in Zurich, whose name did not appear in any newspaper, but whose signature appeared on documents that quietly moved the price of wheat across 3 continents. The ledger had been buried with the family. Everyone had believed this. Everyone had been wrong. Naomi had memorized it. At 9 years old, in one night, because her father had made her, because her father had known what was coming, because her father had believed that a child's memory was the safest vault in the world. She had carried the ledger inside her skull for 24 years. She had not used it. She had waited. She had waited because using it too early would have made her a target before she had the resources to survive being one. She had waited because using it required proving it, and proving it required money and lawyers and intelligence networks and the patient construction of a humanitarian foundation whose reach quietly rivaled that of small nations. She had waited because she had promised her father that when she used the ledger, she would use it in a way that could not be undone. She had spent 24 years becoming the woman capable of keeping that promise. Kang Do-hyun listened to all of this in silence. When she finished, he sat for a long time with his hands folded in his lap, and then he asked her the only question that mattered. "Who is at the top of the circle?" Naomi met his eyes. "Your brother," she said. Kang Do-hyun did not move. His brother, Kang Do-jin, had died at the age of 23 in a plane crash over the Sea of Japan. There had been a funeral. There had been an urn. There had been a headstone in the family cemetery in Gyeonggi, and Kang Do-hyun had visited that headstone every year on the anniversary for 10 consecutive years. "He is alive," Naomi said gently. "He staged the crash. He blames you for choosing me. He believes I made you soft. He believes our marriage weakened the family and cost us the throne of Asia. He has spent 10 years building the circle into the instrument he intends to use to correct what he considers your mistake." Kang Do-hyun closed his eyes. The silence in the room was not empty. It was the silence of a man who had just been told, calmly, that his own grief had been alive for a decade, and that the older brother he had wept for was not only alive but had spent those 10 years planning the murder of the woman sitting across from him. How long have you known?" he said. "6 months. "Why did you wait?" "Because I needed him to make the first move, and last night at the gala he did." Kang Do-hyun opened his eyes. Naomi permitted herself the smallest of smiles. It was not a happy smile. It was the smile of a woman who had spent 24 years learning to make a specific expression and had finally, after all that time, earned the right to make it. "Victoria Blake," she said, "was not an accident. She was placed. He sent her. He wanted to see whether I would react publicly. He wanted to see whether I would break character. He wanted, most of all, to confirm that I was who he suspected I was. And you let her. I let her, and now he knows, and now I know that he knows, and now we can begin." 3 weeks later, in a suite at the Four Seasons in Seoul, Victoria Blake opened her hotel room door to find Naomi Kang standing in the hallway with a folder in her hand. Victoria did not speak. She could not. Her carefully rehearsed apology, which she had drafted 17 different times over the past 3 weeks and never sent, evaporated the moment she saw the woman she had insulted standing calmly outside her door. "May I come in?" Naomi said. Victoria stepped aside. Naomi entered. She did not sit. She placed the folder on the small writing desk near the window and turned to face the younger woman. "You were used," Naomi said. "I know this. You do not need to explain. I am not here for an apology. I am here to offer you a choice." Victoria found her voice, though it was not the voice she recognized as her own. "What choice?" "You can go home. Your family will absorb the scandal. In 2 years you will be forgotten. In 5 you will marry a minor viscount who drinks too much, and you will have the life you were raised to want. This is one option. It is not a bad one." She paused. "Or you can help me." Victoria stared at her. "Help you do what?" "Help me end the man who used you. Help me end the organization that murdered my parents. Help me build something after it is over. I am not offering you redemption, Miss Blake. Redemption is a private matter. I am offering you usefulness. In my experience, usefulness is a great deal more satisfying than redemption, and it lasts longer." Victoria sat down on the edge of the bed. She did not sit gracefully. She simply sat because her legs had stopped negotiating with her. "Why me?" she said. "Because you are the only person in Seoul he trusts to fail, and I have a use for a woman he expects to fail." Victoria looked at her for a long time. Then quietly, she nodded. The operation that followed did not resemble a war. It resembled a symphony. Over the following 2 months, Naomi Kang and Kang Do-hyun, and to the surprise of nearly everyone including herself, Victoria Blake, orchestrated what international intelligence services would later call the largest coordinated dismantling of a transnational political financial network in modern history. It began with a leaked schedule suggesting Naomi would attend a diplomatic summit in Vienna alone. It ended, 47 days later, with the simultaneous arrest of 143 individuals across 19 countries, the freezing of 211 bank accounts, the recovery of documents that would trigger 17 separate parliamentary investigations, and the quiet, unglamorous surrender of a man named Kang Do-jin on the unfinished 42nd floor of a Seoul skyscraper. He had come to that rooftop expecting a confrontation with his brother. He had come with a proposition, whispered through a proxy the day before, that had promised Kang Do-hyun a final choice. The empire, the proposal had said, or the wife. Kang Do-hyun had come to the rooftop alone. He had come without security. He had come, at his wife's request, without a weapon. He had listened to his brother speak for 9 minutes. Then he had smiled the small, tired smile of a man who had been carrying a specific answer inside him for 24 years, waiting for the exact question that would finally allow him to speak it. "I built the empire," Kang Do-hyun said, "because our father taught me that power was the only defense against a world that would take everything from us if we allowed it. I believed him. I built it. And then I married a woman who taught me a different sentence." He looked out over the lights of Seoul. "Power is not what protects you," he said. "Power is what allows you to protect someone else, and a man who has nothing worth losing has nothing worth having." He turned back to his brother. "You may keep the empire," he said. "I do not want it anymore." And then, with a small gesture to a woman who had been listening from a receiver in a car parked 12 blocks away, he authorized the simultaneous release of every document, every recording, every account, every name that the Eclipse Circle had spent 30 years accumulating. Every secret his own family had accumulated alongside it. Every asset, every leverage, every knife that had been held to the throat of every government in Asia for a generation. Gone. In 11 seconds, uploaded to the servers of every major news organization and every relevant law enforcement agency on Earth. Kang Do-jin was arrested 6 minutes later. The empire, such as it had been, did not survive the week. 6 months later, on a warm evening in early autumn, the Phoenix Foundation held its next annual gala. The chandelier still held its 12,000 crystals. The champagne was still Krug. The string quartet on the balcony played the same 3 pieces they had played for 11 consecutive years. But when the double doors opened and when the room turned and when the whispers began, they were different whispers. Because this time, when Kang Do-hyun walked into the ballroom, he was holding his wife's hand. Not one step behind, not concealed, not protected by anonymity. Her name was on the invitations. Her photograph had been on the cover of 3 magazines that month. Her foundation had, in the past 6 months, quietly resettled 14,000 orphan children and funded the reconstruction of 41 hospitals across 3 continents. Across the ballroom, near the west pillar where 6 months earlier a young woman in emerald had rehearsed a mistake, stood Victoria Blake. She wore a simple black gown. She wore no jewelry. Her hair was pulled back into a low, unadorned knot. She had, in the past 6 months, become the operations director of the Adebayo Kang Global Humanitarian Trust, and she had, in the same 6 months, become a woman her younger self would not have recognized and her older self would not have believed possible. She saw Naomi across the ballroom. She inclined her head. Naomi inclined hers in return. Nothing else passed between them. Nothing else needed to. Madame Seo, at the same table she had occupied 6 months earlier, lowered her wine glass with the same careful precision and turned to her granddaughter, who was now old enough to be attending her first gala. "Halmione," the granddaughter whispered, "which one is the important woman?" Madame Seo smiled. "The quiet one, child," she said. "It is always the quiet one." The story of Naomi Kang became, in the years that followed, the kind of story that circulated in whispers through the ballrooms of Seoul and London and Lagos and New York, retold by mothers to daughters and by grandmothers to granddaughters. And it was always retold with the same closing sentence, because the sentence had, over time, become the story's spine. The loudest person in the room is rarely the most powerful. The one everyone overlooks often carries the greatest crown. If this story stayed with you, if you felt the room go quiet when Naomi walked toward that stage, if you felt something settle in your chest when Do-hyun finally chose her over the empire, then hit that subscribe button. This channel tells stories of quiet women, patient revenge, and the people the world forgets to watch until it is far too late to look away.